Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Let's talk about the most pointless material used as PvP when people run out of things to talk about in StarRail or actually any gacha game. Tier lists. If you've spent a single second in any gaming community, especially in gacha, you know what a tier list looks like. It's a format which employs relative comparison under certain parameters. The resulting image usually is a very straightforward power ranking of whatever the subject is. This format has existed for decades at this point because of how easy it is to make and simple it is to understand, and I'm not gonna suggest to remove it in any way. This video will only be explaining the place of tier lists, specifically using examples from StarRail, but you can pretty much apply this video to practically any form of media at this point. So, let's answer the question, why does nobody like tier lists? So first of all, before getting into why tier lists oftentimes do more bad than intended good, let's pinpoint first what are the intentions of tier lists in the first place, either with good or bad faith. To get this out of the way, the first reason you could be doing tier lists is for your entertainment, either through your own entertainment or for the sake of others. Much like anything else the community does, if something can be considered fun, people will do it. Fan art, shipping, fanfiction, build cards, anything. The factual accuracy may be sacrificed to maximize fun in these forms of media, and there's nothing wrong with that. If you are making a tier list simply for fun for other people and yourself to laugh at, that's perfectly fine, and anyone that says otherwise is frankly a pretty miserable person. However, there are some unfortunate instances where a for fun tier list can be taken out of context from a big content creator and start a fire, but hopefully people are smart enough these days to not do that, right? For the more objective-minded and frankly the prime reason it exists, a tier list presents a comparison. Tier lists exist for the sole purpose of sorting characters by how good they are through objective or subjective means. The resulting tier list by itself is not really worth anything, but it can be presented as an informational guide. If a player who does not know how power scaling works in a game asks who's the better character, a tier list can give a direct decision to help them and optimize their gameplay or strategy. With enough of a platform, this tier list can be taken as gospel and spread around to give a guide to much of the community. Another reason why tier lists exist in the first place is for simplification. New players and those that simply don't engage into deeper mechanics cannot understand very detailed guides and wish to use a more digestible format. Tier lists are quote-unquote perfect for that. As an example, I want to know who's better, Volatile or Firefly. I can give you multiple bullet points of why each character has their own advantages in a 10-minute video, but at the end of the day, if it means one isn't better than the other, I can simply put both in the same tier. And that by itself saved a lot of time for both parties. A newbie can easily understand both are the same power level while avoiding things they don't bother to learn, and a guide maker can give a general point without needing to write a Google Doc about it. To go back to the first point, if a tier list grows large enough of a platform, it can be used as a consensus tool, either chicken or egg, which comes first. What I mean by chicken or egg is that tier lists can be influenced by the average clear time of players or the opinions of experts. The fact that a certain section of the player base can submit to a number-based tier list can mean that tier lists are used to gauge how the players have had a hard or easy time with a stage, or how the experts view a character. This by itself is not useless, it's incredibly useful to gauge player consensus. However, another thing can happen. Due to the results of either average clear time or opinions of experts, tier lists can sway the consensus of a section of the community. Yes, I'm implying that tier lists can be used to further an agenda. If the general player base is clearing slower with Fei Xiao and it is reflected on a tier list, that can be used as a further justification to not use or pull Fei Xiao. If an expert says Firefly is better than Acheron, those that don't know any better will spread that as a general guideline. We'll get into later why specifically these are obviously bad, but for now anybody will agree that a large enough tier list can be used to gauge player base opinions or usage. Now to get into the meat of the matter. Why do people not like tier lists? First of all, it's volatile. Honkaistarrail is obviously a live service game. Thus, a tier list has a short lifespan that can be as short as 2 weeks due to the endgame cycle. While it is less of a problem in HSR, for some games that have rapid schedules and power creep, a tier list being released and becoming obsolete in a month outright makes tier lists trivial. For example, Opera Omnia had events every week that usually came with a character update, and due to the format of its endgame and power spike, tier lists were devalued and became obsolete very quickly. You were pretty much clowned on if you ever attempted making a tier list, which is insane to me. Imagine a guide pamphlet being useless every week. At some point, people are gonna catch on and hate tier lists if the pace is rapid enough. Speaking of which, let's dissect it some more. Even if the endgame didn't change at all, there's still a lot of problems with tier lists. Like we said earlier, tier lists can be used as a guideline to help player decisions. In a gacha game, this usually means who has the higher pull value. And here lies one of the biggest failures of tier lists. One metric isn't everything. If we take a look at the strongest units in the game, there's a clear ranking among them. Under the neutral 3-target fight, here are your results for the highest damage dealers from highest to lowest. Aglaya, Rappa, Fei Xiao, Acheron, and lastly Firefly. While you can strictly look at the damage numbers, if you dig a little deeper, it gets much more complicated. Aglaya may be the best damage dealer but the most expensive option, while being a little too reliant on one unit. Rappa has a lower cost than Aglaya but falls further at single target. Fei Xiao has similar cost as Aglaya but inversely of Rappa, falls at AoE. Acheron has a high floor that utilizes cheap underused nihilities to free up competitive harmonies. Firefly is the easiest to play with safe brute forcing despite being the weakest. These damage dealers appeal to different people, and reducing them to one single letter in a power ranking loses that detail. Firefly's kit may not be strong, but for someone that cannot optimize high level Fei Xiao play, Firefly will be the better choice for them to invest in. Acheron may fall behind from Aglaya, but her team structure can lead to much easier team building on the second side, and so on. This is why the player base that digs into meta despise tier lists that involve all characters. People have different tastes, and when they see a character within their taste fall behind without the detailed explanations, they get very angry. Whether the fans realize why they think the character is stronger or not, tier lists are really bad at judging characters under multiple criterias. To connect to the previous point, the reason why tier lists are bad advice to some people is roster sensitivity. The problem of a tier list as a form of pulling or strength guide is it isn't applicable for all accounts because they are judging every character based on if you have every character in the game to your picking. Certain characters may be S tier in a vacuum, but an inefficient pull for your account. If you own Firefly and Acheron as the centerpieces of your account with very limited resources, no matter how much Robin presents herself as better than everyone, you'd rather first pick up the relatively worse Ron Mei and Zhao Chou. With the way StarRail is trending with specific supports like Tribi for the Herta, this is going to be a much more common pattern later on. In general, beginners can take tier lists as pulling advice a little bit more safely due to the fact that they can practically choose any character. But for mid-level investment where every pulling decision means everything to clear all endgame modes and you've run through your supply of limited resources already, you're gonna have to take tier lists with a massive grain of salt, as the unlimited pool which they are built on isn't applicable to when you only have a limited pool of selection that comes from a roster building gacha game. And you can see why people really don't like tier lists as guides because of this. Some mid-level accounts get confused pulling on every mismatched S tier character when having a strategic combination of A tier characters can be better. Taking advice from tier lists is rightfully not recommended because of this. This sorta connects with the timeliness of tier lists. Format changes include what the enemy's mechanics are, what the endgame mode is biased on, and what specific blessings there are. For example, Jade and Rappa. You could make a legitimate case of putting them on A tier due to the lack of AoE enemies, but once they did add AoE enemies, now they are S tier. Fei Xiao naturally was the opposite and dropped tiers due to the influx of AoE. This is no longer just the kit itself in a vacuum. We are taking in mind of the environment environment on which tiers units are placed in. This can apply to enemies. Aglaya is having a fun time fighting energy granting enemies, but obviously it's gonna feel worse once they go away. Sparkle releasing in the midst of break-in DOT blessings in endgame was a death wish for her character. When you look at these cases, tier lists become unreliable, as it is not only ranking units now, but how the units are ranked in a volatile environment, in which case the tier list can get filled unwillingly by double standards, or seemingly just make no sense, or change every few weeks. In general, the simplicity of tier lists are its downfall and why it's so big. Removing these nuances that people don't care about to know is fairly coveted, but once you have to know that nuances actually matter, then you run into the problem with the format. Simple is better, but being simple also cuts off a lot of good fat that you need to understand. Simplicity and being concise in expressing media is always a good thing, but not for the cost of necessary information. Lastly, and I feel the need to say that I'm not calling anyone out specifically, but the consensus is not always right. While it is useful to have data on player clear times, it's really easy to get the wrong interpretation of data. The Danheng dilemma is a clear example of survivor bias. Danheng fans are so good at playing that anyone that can clear with Danheng in the first place results in a really low cycle count that can rack up the lowest cycle count average. This is why you sometimes see him on the top of average cycle counts despite the abysmal usage rate. Similarly, with a popular unit like Acheron, so many people of all skill levels like using her that her average cycle clear can be really unreliable. While data-driven tier list is about as good as we can get at this point, it's far from perfect and cannot be considered necessarily right. If the consensus is shaped by expert players, now we have a real problem. You can have the most objective, expert players in the world, and there's two results you're gonna get. A tier list so neutral that there's barely any tiers in the first place, or pushing multiple agendas. An expert player can rank Zila and Volatile really high, but their playstyle does not click with others even with objective screenshot damage backing it up. A small subsection of the community, or even any section of the community, cannot cover all the mindsets to dictate to people which character is better than the other. And you can understand why this specifically would make players mad at tier lists. There's way too many skill levels, account structures, and tastes that it becomes an utterly miserable topic to discuss if it's objective or not. With all of that rant being said, does that mean there's no good way to do a tier list? The thing is, the more categories, parameters, ambition, and characters there are in a tier list, the worse it gets. Tier lists oftentimes are at their best when it's so specific that almost all the time there's practically no debate about it. Ranking every DPS is way more difficult than ranking every the Herta support, in which case you can figure that out in less than 5 minutes, probably because there's less characters, parameters, and categories to take into account. There's also the outliers who are so extreme that you can't ever doubt their placing in a tier list. For example, Arlan being bottom in any tier list is pretty fair game. Anyway, tier lists can still work, and even with all the problems it has stuck around for a really good reason. It's an amazing format to simplify your thoughts into a set of units. But when expanding the scope of tier lists, you really need to start taking care of it, as it progressively gets more out of control. Even if you are the most objective person in the world, making a tier list would be difficult, and some wrong takes cannot be avoided with expanding scope. And since tier lists with a wide scope are much more coveted by the casual player base, it is shared around. Thus, you are more prone to see the failures of the tier list system than its good examples, and get really tired of seeing it. Honestly, with how things are, I'm still surprised people take tier lists in HSR seriously at all. But then again, never mind, I'm actually not surprised people still take tier lists seriously in HSR. Anyway, I hope you guys like this video. I've been ranting for way too long. I've ran out of spit. That's inappropriate to say. Like, comment, subscribe, do the algorithm stuff. I'll see you next week. Bye bye.